Last time we played Yu-Gi-Oh! We were able to take the deck of Joey Wheeler to great success in Eternal Duelist Soul, beating every opponent in the game through human ingenuity and willpower alone. Needless to say, the response to those videos were great, and I got a lot of comments asking for a follow-up with a different game in the series, so here I am, making good on those requests. Though I'm throwing a bit of a curveball with this one. Rather than returning to the Duel Monsters era and getting randomly eviscerated by some of the most powerful cards in the game's history, we'll be instead looking ahead to the future of the series to see just how the game has evolved since then. A little bit further. Yeah, that one. The third generation of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is famous for many things. For one, it contrasted with the previous two anime with its darker narrative tone and more complex story, but it also started the trend of polarizing the fanbase by introducing the first new extra deck monster type since the game's inception, Synchro Monsters. Come on guys, it's just basic edition, it's really not that scary. But more importantly for our purposes here, the 5D's era brought us 3 World Championship games for the Nintendo DS, 2009's Stardust Accelerator, 2011's Over the Nexus, and the game we'll be playing today, 2010's Reverse of Arcadia. While Eternal Duelist Soul and Dark Duel Stories were the games to introduce me to Yu-Gi-Oh!, having grown up during the 5D's era myself, Reverse of Arcadia is one of the games to truly make me a fan of the series. Unlike most Yu-Gi-Oh! Games that act as simulators for the card game and nothing more, the 5D's World Championship games have fully fledged story modes where you get to create your own avatar and insert yourself into the plot of a story arc from the anime. In Reverse of Arcadia's case, this game lets you play through an abridged version of the Dark Signer story arc from the show. Now, unfortunately, since this game is a few generations removed from Duel Monsters, we can't bring in Joey's deck to beat it, since the ban list has changed drastically since that time period, and his supposed cousin Jesse Wheeler refused to comment when asked for a deck profile, so we're going to have to improvise here.
Try harder next time.
Is that Joey Wheeler?
No, man, it's his cousin Jesse Wheeler.
While not someone that fills the same role on a character level as Joey does, though some circles of the fandom may beg to differ, Akiza Izinski is probably the character most deserving of redemption among Team 5Ds. Many have complained at how, past the Dark Signer's arc, Akiza's relevance in the story drastically diminished, and the time she was relevant, the writers decided to make a fool out of her in various ways. A shame too, given how interesting of a character she was, only to be reduced to a benchwarmer for the main crew, and you might think that's harsh of me to say, but even the people behind Yu-Gi-Oh! Nowadays seem to think of her so lowly. Because of that, we're going to see if Akiza's deck is capable of carrying us through the entirety of the Dark Signer crisis, and if Akiza alone, with a little help along the way, can stop the revival of the King of the Netherworld. That all said, hello everybody, StupidStudiosN here, and today we'll be attempting to beat the story mode for Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's World Championship 2010 Reverse of Arcadia, using only Akiza's deck. So, without further ado, let's rev it up! As mentioned before, we'll start by going into the character creator, make the best Akiza we can possibly create with our limited cosmetic options, and we're going to immediately skip through the first chapter of the game. Because of plot reasons, we're forced to use a basic Psychic deck for this chapter with no access to the deck we would otherwise be able to use, and since there's no available way at the moment to hack the game to replace this deck with our own, we're just going to skip past this part. So, after a few hours of doing cult shenanigans broken up by duel puzzles and challenges, we are eventually forced to deal with another Akiza, and after being flung into a wall, we lose consciousness, get sent to a flashback sequence, and can start the challenge proper with Chapter 2. Before we do that though, since this is the earliest point in which we can change our deck, let's go over real quick just what exactly we'll be playing for the rest of the game. As expected, Akiza runs a deck focused around plant-type monsters, with her ace card being the Synchro monster Black Rose Dragon. Comparable to Joey's Red Eyes Black Dragon, this is a level 7 dragon monster with 2400 attack, though slightly less defense, sitting at 1800. However, the effect of this card is where it really shines. On summon, Black Rose Dragon can destroy all cards on the field, including itself. This makes it a really good panic button for when you need to reset the board state quickly. Consequently, since it destroys all cards on the field, including itself, it's pretty tricky to bring back, especially since Akiza's only revival card, Miracle Fertilizer, can only special summon plant monsters from the grave. That said, in the context of our deck, we might not want to activate this first effect, as this card has another generally good utility option as well. Its second effect lets us banish a plant monster from our graveyard to switch an opponent's monster from defense position to attack position, and reduce its attack to 0. This is great for making damage swings and baiting out the very obvious flip monsters our opponent might have set, like the ever-common Raiko the Lightsworn Hunter that was in most decks around this time. To round out the extra deck, we also have 3 copies of Queen of Thorns. It's a decent monster, its effect forcing both players to pay 1000 life points to summon a non-plant type monster, but because of the levels not working out the best with our monster lineup, this will mostly just be used for corner cases. And speaking of our monster lineup, moving on to our level 4s, we have our floaters, 3 copies of Lord Poison, which special summons a plant in our graveyard when it's destroyed by battle, 1 copy of Mystical Tomato, which specials out a dark monster of 1500 or less attack from our deck when it's destroyed by battle, and our best target for the tomato is Violet Witch, which searches out a plant monster with 1500 or less defense from our deck when it's, you guessed it, destroyed by battle. Otherwise, we have 3 Botanical Lion, a 1600 attack, 2000 defense monster that gains 300 attack for each plant monster on the field, including itself. It also can switch control to our opponent, so it's a great counter for Brain and Mind Control, 2 cards we're also running in here that take an opponent's monster until the end of the turn. In addition, there's Gigantic Cephalotus. It hits hard, but frankly, I mostly just use it along with Dark Verger and Copy Plan as discard fodder for Lightning Vortex whenever it seems to show up. Hitting hard is nice, but destroying all face-up monsters my opponent controls is much more desirable. We also run 2 copies of Lone Fire Blossom, which contribute any plant monster we control, including itself, to special summon out any plant monster from our deck Titanial. We're special summoning Titanial every time. Yeah, Black Rose may be our ace, but Titanial, Princess of Camellias, is our plan A. As a quick effect, to contribute a plant monster, including itself, to negate the activation of a card that targets cards on the field. And at 2800 attack, this will be winning most of our games hands down. Hell, I think even the devs knew how strong this card was, as it's one of the few cards to actually have a summon animation in this game. Anyway, for our tuner monsters, we run 2 of the level 4 Witch of the Black Rose. On summon, it draws a card, and if it's a monster, we get to keep it, otherwise it destroys itself and sends the card we drew to the grave. Given our deck composition, it's a 50-50 on if this works in our favor or not, so I guess Akiza has a similarity to Joey there in that this is most definitely a gamble card. The other monster is Twilight Rose Knight. This will be our main playmaker as it special summons a level 4 or lower plant monster from our hand and keeps our opponent from targeting plants for attack. Since it's a level 3 tuner, this makes it a prime candidate for synchro summoning out Black Rose Dragon given the effect. Now for our spells and traps, aside from the ones we've already mentioned, most of these are just generic good stuff like Scapegoat, Heavy Storm, Mystical Space Typhoon, Twister, Bottomless Trap Hole, Dimensional Prison, and Torrential Tribute, but there's a few other inclusions here that play a little more into the deck's theme. Fragrant Storm pops a plant monster on the field and draws us a card, and if the card we end up drawing is another plant monster, we get to draw a second one. Mark of the Rose is our 3rd and 4th copies of Brain Control and Mind Control, letting us take an opponent's monster during our turns for the cost of banishing a plant from our grave. Black Garden is a field spell that halves the attack of all monsters normal or special summoned and summons a low attack token to the opposite side of the field, and Overdream Line is just useless, and yet we run 2 copies of it for some reason. It's a long-winded explanation of our deck, but there's a lot more moving parts here compared to DM era decks, which mostly consisted of the same 30 cards with minor alterations to the remaining 10 here and there. I won't be doing this for every deck this time around, since there's a lot more ground to cover, but I figured I'd at least talk about what we're playing in a bit more detail. That's for our first real chapter. Plot-wise, we changed from being in a cult to a gang, so, improvement? Anyway, we break into a police station, retrieve our deck, and proceed to body a small child with Titanial Black Rose Beatdown for our first duel. After practicing our motorcycle skills and proving I should never be allowed within 10 feet of any high-speed, 2-wheeled vehicle, we're challenged by Callan Kessler to a duel, and this is our first problem spot of the run. He runs a pretty hefty amount of back row in tandem with cards that inflict effect damage to us. After attempting to use Black Rose to punish Callan for setting most of his hand onto the field, we're hit by Destruction Jammer, negating our board nuke and letting him retaliate for most of our life points. We still have a pretty decent duel going as Lightning Vortex gets us through his monsters, and Callan gives us a scare with Cemetery Bomb burning us for every card in our graveyard and leaving us with 150 life points remaining. Fortunately, 1 whiff from Callan on the draw and we're able to scrape by without a loss in this duel, though it was a very close game. After that, though, we get into a turf war and have to fight our way through a few generic duelists to proceed. The first 2 aren't of much note, but their leader, Hiroyuki, is the first opponent we'll encounter with a special rule attached to their duel, his being that both players draw 2 cards instead of 1 for the draw phase. This ultimately puts us in a pretty favorable position as we're able to establish Titanial and Black Garden, locking him out of summoning monsters that can get over ours. Heavy Storm is able to clear both his back row and our mutual floodgate, and we're able to punt this orphan-turned-gang leader far into the sun with the summon of Black Rose Dragon. So, with one rival gang down, we move on to the next, and after a race against one of their members to retrieve a kidnapped child, we get to challenge them to a duel. While they're an easy opponent and we sweep them pretty quickly, this is one of the few random NPC duelists that stick out to me as they play a deck consisting of primarily turtle monsters. Most of them have zero synergy whatsoever, but I appreciate them sticking to a gimmick like this at least. But after invading their base and dueling 2 of the lackeys, including the guy who really likes turtles once more, for good measure, we take on their boss, Ida. His gimmick is that we play a proper best-of-3 match against him in order to win, and this goes on for a bit. Compounded with the need to use Black Garden to stall out the game, we spend a good few turns in both rounds just setting monsters to avoid our own attack decrease effect. And I did say both games because it was still a clean 2-0 sweep in our favor, despite not having a side deck to take advantage of this boss's gimmick. It would seem no one just yet has been able to give us any pause so far, and rematching Callan right after doesn't change this, as we even managed to sweep him quicker than last time. We also duel with Crow, and while he plays a Blackwing deck, utilizing a powerful Synchro archetype for the era doesn't seem to favor him much either. Afterwards, we get into a tag duel with Crow as our partner, and we're eventually able to pull together a win, even if it took the AI an eternity to decide there are several riveting turns of just normal summoning one monster and attacking. But moving on, we participate in another gang war, mess around in a block-pushing puzzle ripped straight out of something like Tales of Symphonia, and move on to the boss of this area. At first, Gushizawa's special rule seems fair enough. Start with 4,000 life points, just like how the anime or Duel Links would handle things, you'd think. Until you realize this restriction only applies to you, and then the panic starts to set in. Even more terrifying when you see the opponents playing 6 Samurai, a very real deck from this time period. Fortunately, it's played very suboptimally, as one might expect. After rocketing my anxiety up through the roof with the jump scare from 6 Samurai United being activated, we're able to calm down, activate Brain Control to take his cam on, use Copy Plant to copy the level of our Lord Poison on the field, and tune it with a stolen monster to make Black Rose Dragon. Maybe I shouldn't have disregarded Copy Plant as being just discard fodder in the deck overview, but either way. And on our opponent's following turn, he's able to establish another 6 Samurai, getting to resolve the full effect of his continuous spell, letting him Pot of Greed all over the place. This nets him a copy of Grandmaster of the 6 Samurai, special summoning it, and getting over our Lord Poison. Fortunately, this practically spells the end of the game for our opponent, as we can use our 2 copies of Mark of the Rose to turn his 2 monsters into tribute fodder for the Titanial we drew in our opening hand, letting us wrap things up in a swift 5 turns. Some plot later, we do a few casual duels with the rest of the Enforcers. Yusei goes down without much fuss, no Stardust Dragon at this point, so he's not able to make anything too crazy for us to get over. But our duel with Jack Atlas goes much differently, however. Because we opened up with an incredibly unplayable hand, his dragons are able to give us our only loss so far, but because there were no stakes for this duel, we're still able to continue with the plot. I mean, hey, we take those, I guess. Anyway, Callan bullies a small child, plot happens, he gets arrested, we get kidnapped, and this catches us up to the present day where we begin Chapter 3. And then we are promptly transported into a fantasy landscape after attempted brainwashing. Jokes aside, we're introduced to Tarunka, the spirit of Dark Sage afflicted by the magic of Z-Man the Ape King to make him appear as a child. We of course duel them to prove our worth, and you'd be forgiven for thinking they're on a Dark Magician deck given what monster they're based on, but no. Instead, Tarunka plays an Endymion deck. No, that's a little too recent. Hang on, I conveniently have a Minus Staff on hand, let me just... Oh, thank god, if I had to sit through Tempest Magician FTK in this game, I'd probably lose it. That said, while Tarunka might not be running the spell counter strategy at its fullest potential, this duel still ends up being a challenge. Though we put Titanial on board, we're hit with Creature Swap, forcing us to give it to our opponent, with them following that up with Swords of Revealing Light. Fortunately, since we're dealing with an AI opponent, however, they naturally did something stupid to where this doesn't automatically win them the game outright. Prior to using Creature Swap, they summoned Cryomancer of the Ice Barrier, using its effect to discard a card and make it to where wind attribute monsters cannot attack it. Hilariously, since they had to give it to us, Titanial couldn't be used to get over their own monster. Gotta love old Yu-Gi-Oh! Games sometimes. You'd think you'd seen it all after Graceful Charity under Imperial Order, but nope, these games are just full of surprises.
You stupid.
Not out of the woods just yet though, both figuratively and literally here, as we're forced to use Black Garden, which grinds the game down to a near standstill while we try to chip away at Tarunka's board. Eventually though, we're able to put Black Rose on the board, clearing things up, and follow up with Lone Fire into our second Titanial, putting us back in the driver's seat of this game. With our opponent's limited resources at this stage, it's not long before we're able to wrap things up from here. After that duel, we politely asked the Gatekeeper to let us into Zeman's castle, and they challenged us to a duel instead. The nerve. Unsurprisingly, the Monkey, Iki, is on the Monkey Brain deck, and boy oh boy, big number do go burr. We've had some close calls we've been able to come back from, but this one takes the cake so far. Berserk Gorilla and Behemoth, King of all animals, puts in a great deal of work against us, knocking us down to exactly 50 life points. Fortunately, with consistent attack reduction, coupled with the tokens it generates for us, Black Garden is able to keep our opponent from closing that gap, while Mark of the Rose lets us use Iki's Behemoth against him each turn. Having a 2k attack monster switching hands frequently proves to be more of a liability than anything though, so I clear the field spell and equip with Heavy Storm, make Queen of Thorns using a token and Witch of the Black Rose, and get the board state truly under my control from this position. Giant Red is a nuisance to get rid of as it floats into more of itself, but after establishing a Black Rose Dragon and forcing a face-down monster to be a door to our opponent's life points, we're eventually able to knock down one of Zeman's goons to 0. Fortunately for us, we're able to just walk into the castle from here, and oh god, there's another one, and he's somehow even more aggressive. Unlike Iki, whose strategy revolved around bringing up Behemoth, Zape's Synchro Beast deck relies more so on the low-level beaters like Panther Warrior and Gene Warped Werewolf. And it's because of how quick this deck can lay into us with damage that a well-timed Mirror Force is enough to make us quickly lose tempo in this duel, netting us our first true game over for the run.
You stupid.
Attempt 2 favors us a lot more, however, though annoyingly Zape is able to play Spiritual Force, which protects all of his beasts from battle destruction once per turn. While we do have a Mystical Space Typhoon to answer this problem, I elect to save it knowing Mirror Force is a very real threat this deck poses now. Though it's slow, having Black Rose Dragon established is able to lock our opponent out of safely putting monsters to defense, meaning we're able to do chip damage for a time. At least until XX Saber Goddams hits the board and I feel obligated to Torrential Tribute it. Despite that, we have a Lone Fire Blossom ready to make Titanial, and we're quickly able to wrap up the game from here, even sniping the Mirror Force our opponent had towards the end of the game. So, more abridged 5D story later, I'm dropped straight into an environmental puzzle ripped straight out of Golden Sun, and then we take on the Duel Spirit Regulus. Hilariously, this duel only lasts about a fraction of the time I spent solving that dumb puzzle meant for 12-year-olds. Because Regulus plays Forced in his deck, which boosts the attack of our plant monsters along with some of his monsters, we're able to pressure him even harder with a Titanial comparable in strength to the Blue Eyes White Dragon. It's crazy how that duel was meant to close out the chapter, but oh well, on to Chapter 4. And we're in Cult Jail. Well, shit. Well, I guess while we figure out a way of getting out of here, now's as good a time as any to say that if you're enjoying the video so far, consider leaving it a like and comment below to let me know your thoughts. Also, did you know that according to my YouTube analytics, around 15% of my current subscribers are being held prisoner in an evil overlord's lair? All things considered, that's a really sizable amount of people, and while I have no idea how that happened, I absolutely will not stand for this. So if you want to join forces in taking down the mysterious mastermind behind this plot while also supporting the channel, consider hitting that subscribe button. Anyway, on with the show. After breaking out of Cult Jail and busting out Luna in the process, it's time for a rematch against the cult friends we made back in Chapter 1 that I didn't mention because... Chapter 1. And oh, would you look at that, in the time it took for us to finish that sentence, Titanial hit them for games so hard it knocked the brainwashing right out of them. Fancy that. Anyway, we run into Sayer, the cult leader and professional emotional abuser, though those might as well be synonyms if I'm being perfectly honest. He too is no match for the dream combo of Lone Fire into big 2800 attack beatstick, so after Uno reversing him with Hinotama IRL, the Dark Signers show up, cause some havoc, and we escape the scene, ending Chapter 4. And so we've made it to the final chapter of the game, though it's definitely a bit lopsided compared to the rest of what we've gone through so far, especially considering my script still goes on for another 12 pages here. We'll be doing a lot more dueling from here on out, and oh boy, we have some real doozies ahead of us. After running a quick errand for Yusei, we come back to find a possessed guy harassing Akiza, and oh god, he's running counter fairies. Though we draw back row removal, it turns out the cards he set on the first turn in conjunction with the summon of Bountiful Artemis for continuous traps. Thankfully, this doesn't proc Artemis's draw effect, but we should still probably deal with them as they're still floodgates. We enter the anti-spell Fragrance with Twister, leaving Curse of Darkness up since it has a weaker effect comparatively. However, the headache has only just begun as attacking Artemis with our Titanial is met with the activation of Honest from the hand. This boosts their monster's attack up by Titanials in the damage step and destroys our monster instead. This puts us in a pretty rough top deck position, and 2 Twilight Rose Knights is not the best situation to find ourselves in. And it's when I see the second Honest summoned out onto the board that I realize just how dire our circumstances are. Though we draw Mark of the Rose, which lets turn Artemis into Black Rose with the second Twilight Rose Knight in our hand, I accidentally misclicked the set button, meaning that I botch our one shot at winning the duel.
You stupid.
And yeah, unsurprisingly, our opponent is able to clean up the game pretty handedly with Artemis and Bokoichi on the following turn. Luckily, the rematch is nowhere near as messy. We're able to keep the offensive position for most of the game, and no shenanigans involving Honest result in us accidentally losing tempo. Hell, we even make up for the first game by summoning Black Rose Dragon like we initially intended and destroy a pretty sizable board of back row from our opponent. With the literal nobody defeated, the other Akiza ends up going insane from watching that, and frankly I can't blame her, but we're forced to duel her now too. After we save, of course. I really don't want to go through that duel again. But boy oh boy, the duel with Akiza turns up into a straight-up slugfest. With 2 Black Gardens in our opener, I play one of them for the Floodgate effect and set Witch of the Black Rose, as the only other monster Akiza can use to get over it would be Titanial. Unfortunately, Gigantic Cephalotus is brought out with Mystical Space Typhoon used in response to the field spell, destroying it before it resolves and letting her destroy our monster anyways. We draw Fragrant Storm on our following turn and summon our second Witch of the Black Rose, drawing us Violet Witch per its effect. Afterwards I set Dimensional Prison and pass turn. While the other Akiza plays out her turn, I'm reading Fragrant Storm and realize in the moment that it doesn't require we destroy our own plant monster specifically in order to use its effect. So on our following turn we activate it, destroying the other Akiza's Lord Poison and drawing us both Titanial and Lord Poison of our own. Literally just better Pot of Greed.
That's not what it does! It doesn't do that.
That is what it does!
It doesn't.
That's what it do, Yugi!
It does what it do!
Not long after, though, we're forced to face against another Black Garden from our opponent, and this drags out the game to a snail's pace. Many turns of fighting through an endless swarm of rose tokens, and we're eventually able to put Black Rose Dragon on board, wiping the slate completely clean once again, and letting us make a lethal push not long after. Only took 25 turns to get to that position. What a game. With our clone defeated, Yusei, Jack, Leo, Luna, and the other Akiza are all called in by Director Goodwin to discuss official signer business. And I guess we're in there too because, protagonist? But after that we talk to Crow and immediately take him on in our first turbo duel for the game. Because turbo duels have a drastically different rule set from regular duels, we can't use our normal deck list that we've been using so far for this challenge. Luckily, since the AI version of Akiza has a turbo duel deck, though it's not required we fight them in the main story, we're able to use that instead here. I won't bother to go over the main changes to our deck since there's only a handful of duels in the game that take place like this, but overall we have a much more powerful kit to work with on the road, incorporating cards like Gigaplant and Phoenixian Cluster Amaryllis to our arsenal. We're also forced to work with the speed counter mechanic, making use of speed spells in place of our normal spell cards, with field spells removed in place of the permanent Speed World 2. We build up speed counters during each standby phase and can spin them to activate speed spells. What this ultimately means is that while we're able to play with more powerful cards, some even banned around this time period, they're given a hefty resource cost preventing us from firing out haymakers back to back. As expected, since spells are much weaker in this format, monster and trap heavy decks are substantially more favored, and seeing as our deck is able to accomplish a lot with floaters and Lone Fire Blossom normally, clipping Crow's Blackwings is a simple task for us. Hey, at least we didn't need Titanial this time. With that, it's time for more exposition and then back into the spirit world to finally free Ancient Fairy Dragon from Z-Man the Ape King after yet another JRPG-inspired puzzle. For this duel, both us and our opponent lose 500 life points during each standby phase, putting this duel on a pseudo-clock for how long we have to finish it. This plays out well in our favor ultimately, as the usual bread and butter combo of everyone's favorite semi-limited plant Lone Fire Blossom is able to quickly establish damage onto the board for us. It also helps that our opponent decided to use Call of the Haunted to revive Berserk Gorilla, knowing that it would have to attack for its effect right into our much bigger monster. Anyway, yeah, we win this one with no trouble at all and return to the real world to finally stop the Dark Signers, first up being Devik, who we take on in a 2v1 duel with Luna helping us out. Surprisingly, Luna has a pretty neat strategy to work with, being a Nurse Burn type deck. Using cards like Bad Reaction to Simochi, plus cards that heal the opponent, she's able to reverse the life point gain effects into massive amounts of effect damage. We also get to see her use a pretty funny combo in the duel itself, involving Creature Swap and giving our opponent Currybon. When it battles, it returns to our hand, so by creature swapping it away, we basically get to steal our opponent's monster for free. And yeah, since our opening hand was already pretty stacked with Brain Control, Lightning Vortex, Lone Fire, and a non-zero amount of beat sticks, while Devik had no handicap to account for this being a 2v1, we push him into a corner after slightly more turns than it took to beat Z-Men. So, Leo and Luna leave the scene and were ambushed by Gregor in a turbo duel not long after. The special rule for this fight is that we must defeat our opponent after they successfully summon their ace monster, Earthbound Immortal Chaku Chalua. This, however, leads to the biggest non-game of Yu-Gi-Oh! I've ever played, as had it not been for this rule set, we could have easily curb-stomped him in a few turns. Instead, we spend about 18 waiting for him to summon his big, useless purple whale, only to quickly evaporate it with Raigeki since we stockpiled on so many speed counters while waiting. On the following turn, after our win condition had been fulfilled, we were able to make a lethal push with a massive board I built thanks to Gigaplant continually reviving our plant monsters. And you know, when I first saw the requirement for this duel, I was absolutely dreading needing to do it because I thought I would be eating dirt for most of my attempts, but I guess I was expecting a bit too much from the guy unironically playing a Flying Fortress Skyfire deck. That said, we press onward to take on Dark Signer Kallen, and if the prospect of fighting a stronger version of him wasn't scary enough, we also have to survive his Earthbound Immortal on the drive up to fight him. I forgot about this from when I played the game years ago and promptly crashed on my first attempt. Crazy how the minigame gave me just about as many game overs as the strongest duelists we faced so far.
You stupid.
Well, after catching up to Yusei and Kallen, making sure to save so I don't have to play New Orleans Driving Simulator 2010 again, we begin yet another turbo duel, and the special rule for this one is that we both start with no cards in hand. While this appears to be a mutual handicap, since Kallen's Infernity deck relies on having no cards for them to gain their effects, it's something of an advantage for him. That said, since this game was released when Infernity only had one wave of support, there's only one card in the deck that would be cataclysmic for us if he drew it early game, and while he runs 3 of it, the odds of him doing so are apparently just enough for him to will Infernity Archfiend to the top of his deck. This immediately lets him special summon the card to the board and search out Infernity Destroyer, for which he tribute summons it, putting a 2300 body on board that inflicts burn damage when it destroys a monster by battle, provided Callan has no cards in hand, of course. We take a truckload of damage from Destroyer before we're able to tutor out Lonefire, getting us Gigaplant, reviving Lonefire, and then putting Titanial on board. Thankfully, the set cards Callan has for back row are likely only spells he can't activate, but the Infernity Clause prevents him from keeping in hand. While Fiend Sanctuary and Brain Control are good cards for Callan to stall with, Titanial is able to negate the Brain Control, and the token produced by Fiend Sanctuary, though it deals damage to us our opponent would otherwise take from battles involving it, the token itself cannot declare an attack. We're able to play around this by attacking it with a monster just strong enough to kill the token without hurting ourselves too much, though. Afterwards, Callan appears to brick on his following draw, letting us wipe the singular back row he set with Black Rose Dragon, and clean things up from here with a direct attack from Lord Poison. Next up is Dark Signer Carly with a Fortune Lady deck. Along with being another Turbo Duel, the special rule is that we both draw 2 cards for our draw phase. While this has proven to be a benefit for us in the last duel we played under these conditions, Carly plays a deck that much better benefits from this rule set. She has one of the few good Earthbound Immortals, Askelapisku, which can attack directly at all times, and does a Raigeki along with burn damage when it leaves the field. Not only that, she also plays a high density of trap cards and quick play spells, and, well, since Heavy Storm is tied to the speed counter mechanic now, these can be much more annoying for us to play around. Early on, I end up making the mistake of using Compulsory Evacuation Device in an attempt to remove the Earthbound Immortal. I should have been more straightforward about destroying it, as most of the mid-game is me just playing around cards like Fires of Doomsday and other various monster protection traps, just because I didn't want to run the risk of seeing it come back while on a full board of monsters. Lucky for us though, by the time it does return to the field, we only have an Amaryllis on board and ways of properly removing Askelapisku still in hand. Even though Carly is still able to establish a massive board presence on the following turn, she's within the life point threshold where destroying Amaryllis would deal lethal burn damage per its effect. But I also messed this up, and thankfully it doesn't matter because we still take her out with Black Rose Dragon anyway. Moving on, we check up on what Akiza 2 is doing and end up rematching Sayer, who's a pushover as always. Misty, on the other hand, who we fight right after, ends up being an incredibly rough duel for us. Not helping that we drew both a copy of Overdoomline and Fragrance Storm, which just plain aren't good cards for us. We also have a Titanial helping brick our opener completely. Not to mention, since Misty's deck revolves around reducing our monsters to 0 attack, our win condition of summon a bunch of really big guys becomes a bit more tricky to accomplish. It also doesn't help that I make many unfortunate mistakes in this duel as well. For starters, I don't think to use Bottomless Trap Hole to stop Reptilian Medusa from coming out, leading to us struggling to get over it, as a second Lonefire Blossom we find is unable to summon the Titanial from our hand. The other big mistake I make here was not searching out Twilight Rose Knight with Mystic Tomato when I had the chance, as I could have run over the Medusa with Black Rose Dragon. Granted, this seems like a bad idea on the grounds that it would leave our boss monster open to a Reptilian reducing its attack to 0 anyways. However, the alternative is having 2 of our monsters reduced to 0 and tributed for the summon of Reptilian Vasky, which we accidentally allow Misty to do through our more defensive plays. Though we hang on for a bit longer with Lord Poison floating into Tomato, the damage is already done at this point and Misty is able to quickly engulf us in a rain of snakes. Our hand is a lot better in the rematch, though that's not really saying much given what we had to work with last game. Granted, our opponent seems to have opened up with a more spell-heavy hand, playing cards that boost the stats of her monsters, including a field spell, meaning that she is able to summon her Earthbound Immortal. And as if right on cue, after we destroy Reptilian Gardna, Misty uses Reptilian Spawn, summoning 2 tokens, and then tributing them for Earthbound Immortal Kokoraya. This power play is thankfully short-lived as we promptly punish them with Bottomless Trap Hole in response, not wanting to make the same mistake as last time. This blows up the entire board, and we get to start applying pressure with no cards from Misty to contest us from this position. Fortunately, because a lot of Misty's cards aren't able to do much on their own, many of them being tribute monsters as well, we're able to start attacking directly uncontested for 2 whole turns. And by the time she does find something to try and stem the bleeding, a top-decked Mark of the Rose is able to quickly steal their last line of defense and let us push for game. Romaine Goodwin is the final Dark Signer we have to face, giving us the challenge of beating him in 20 turns or less. Though he's able to put Earthbound Immortal Uru on board, bringing us down to 3,000 life points, Mark of the Rose allows us to go, Uru, what's this? Letting us take his ace and finish a less than noteworthy duel with 13 turns to spare. So, with all of the Dark Signers defeated, you'd think that's the end of the game, but anyone who's watched 5D's knows there's a bit more to it than that. Returning to Rex Goodwin's mansion, we're challenged by the head of Sector Security, Lazar. No correlation to the superhero with a similar name. Anyway, Lazar plays a stall burn deck, using cards like Nightmare Wheel to lock out our monsters and burn us, Lava Golem to tribute our monsters and burn us further, and Darkroom of Nightmare to burn us when we are already burned. Needless to say, our best course of action is to beat him down fast, lest we...
Burn! Burn to the ground! Burn! Burn! Burn to the ground! Burn to the ground!
Thankfully, we don't see his more annoying cards like Level Limit Area B and Gravity Bind, which would otherwise prevent us from attacking with most of our monsters. And him gifting us Lava Golem doesn't do much either, since we already have the life point advantage to knock him down. But with the Jester done for, we head off to fight the final boss, and to no one's surprise, the guy named Goodwin turned out to be a bad loser. Also, like, incredibly jacked. I'm pretty sure if he wanted his evil plan to succeed, caving our skulls in would be more effective than trying to duel us. In any case, he's sure as hell not going down without a fight, as this is a 3-phase final boss, not even counting the dual runner chase sequence that lasts a grand total of 10 seconds. Phase 1 is a tag duel with us paired with Yusei, while Rex has double life points to compensate. Thank God he's not running Ancient Leaf in his deck, as Triple Pot of Greed would certainly make for one hell of a battle. But regardless of this small oversight in deck building, Rex is able to quickly establish his boss monster, Earthbound Immortal Wiracocha Raska, using the field spell Mausoleum of the Emperor. This field spell so happens to be a staple in decks requiring multiple tributes from this time period, as it lets you substitute the need to sacrifice monsters for life points instead. And Rex certainly has a lot of those to spare. While Yusei is able to help stem the bleeding with Stardust Dragon for a time, the pressure put on by his Earthbound Immortal's hand-ripping effect and direct attacks, coupled with Giant Germ piling on the damage, we don't last long before losing this attempt. Thankfully with attempt 2, Goodwin decides to play his field spell as well as set 3 back row, which is great for us since we have Heavy Storm to answer it. Anyway, Lone Fire into Titanial, lol GG, shake my hand. On to Phase 2, and it's a Turbo Duel. Goodwin plays a deck close to what he did in Phase 1, only now with more of a focus on summoning tribute fodder since new field spells can't be played, meaning no Mausoleum shenanigans here. We're able to see the other half of his core strategy in this game being the summoning of the Synchro monsters Sun Dragon Inti and Moon Dragon Quila, cards that have effects to float into one another when they're destroyed, with damaging or healing properties depending on which one is activating. Fortunately, we never see Goodwin establish the loop here, as he seems to draw more spells and traps than he knows what to do with, letting us apply more than our fair share of pressure against him, until he's downed once again. With that, it's time for the last phase of the fight and the final duel of the story mode as a whole. Goodwin's Immortal Condor deck completely ditches the Celestial Dragon gimmick and puts in more cards to facilitate bringing out the Earthbound Immortal, and Neospatian Air Hummingbird for some reason. Sorry, Jaden. We're able to put up Titanial on turn 1, giving us a pretty good start, though we're still at risk of losing tempo depending on what our opponent draws. Goodwin's turn, he sets up Mausoleum of the Emperor, paying 2,000 life points, and brings out his Earthbound Immortal, intending to hand loop us for 3 with its effect. However, it's here where we see the fatal flaw in this matchup, as since Wiracocha Raska requires the controller to target their own cards first in order to hand rip us, this is an effect Titanial is able to negate and destroy his ace card, leaving him with no monsters and several unusable back row from this position. We apply some pressure with Mystic Tomato, but the following turn Goodwin attempts to summon a second Wiracocha Raska, at which point we try to Torrential Tribute to stop it, but he has Dark Bribe letting him negate that effect. While this hand loops us for 2, fortunately this doesn't hit the Mark of the Rose in our hand, meaning we're able to finish him here, but I decide to style on him first. Thankfully our draw for turn gives us just what we need to do that. We draw off the top Twilight Rose Knight, letting us special summon Lord Poison from our hand and bring out Black Rose Dragon one last time, though we're not going to use the first effect here. Stealing Wiracocha Raska, we first attack Goodwin with his own boss monster, and then deliver the coup de grace with our own. Black Rose Dragon, finish the job with Black Rose Flare! And yeah, if it wasn't painfully obvious by around the halfway mark of the video, if not sooner, it is entirely possible to beat the story mode of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's World Championship 2010 Reverse of Arcadia using only Akiza's deck. Like, not even a contest this time. While this was a surprisingly easy challenge to complete, especially when compared to the last Yu-Gi-Oh! Challenge we did, going through this game gave me a really strong appreciation for how far Yu-Gi-Oh! Games had come up to this point. Don't get me wrong, there's still some issues like the AI making very silly decisions sometimes, but otherwise this game is honestly phenomenal for both giving players a story-driven game in the world of 5Ds, but also for providing a decent challenge at the same time. Despite the AI opponents not being the smartest, the decks here actually felt competent enough without being a hodgepodge of the same 30 or so cards we've seen to death, like with Eternal Duelist Soul's roster. And even though Akiza's deck was able to burn through the entire game off Lonefire, Titanial, and Black Rose Dragon alone, that's not entirely far off from a strategy commonly seen around this time period. Hell, many modern tournament-level decks in one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most popular retro formats, Edison format, still uses the Lonefire combo to great effect there. Not to mention that the format is pretty much entirely playable in Reverse of Arcadia if you have the March 2010 banlist downloaded onto it, which is pretty cool to see. Overall, I had a fun time playing through this one, and I hope that we were able to properly redeem Akiza as a duelist by having her prove she could solo the entirety of the Darksigners on her own. But with that, I look forward to our next visit to the world of Yu-Gi-Oh!, whenever that may be, and whatever I decide to do next, I hope you all look forward to seeing what antics we find ourselves in the future. Until then, this has been StupidStudiosN, signing out. Ciao.